Well, I am just going to make some announcements then without sharing my screen. Because I think I'm seeing some things queued up for the next presentation, so that's okay. So welcome, here we are again. This is the fourth session of the 2023 Grant Wood Country Forum. And what I am loving about this is we've settled into both all the prongs of this endeavor, which is learning about history, having conversation, and doing creative writing, reading things we've written, and it's all just starting to pop. And so I want a special shout out always. Thank you to the Cedar Rapids Public Library and the Anamosa Library and Learning Center for helping get the word out, and Cedar Rapids Library for hosting us, literally technology wise. We appreciate the ongoing partnership and involvement of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And this year, the Iowa Poetry Association. So wonderful to have them involved with us. And so this session, we can look forward to, if anybody has something to read. I know we at least have one person who has a few limericks, so that'll be fun. And then we'll hear from Dawn Terpstra, who will talk about poetic forms from the Grant Wood era. And then we will feature Joe Coffey speaking about city life in the Grant Wood era. And we'll have time for questions and conversations. And so before that, I'll just make a few reminders, housekeeping. Reminder that anyone can register at any time throughout this series. You just hop on. You can, and the same Zoom link works for all sessions. You can register at the Cedar Rapids Public Library free of charge on their website. Go to their event page, and they'll send you the link and reminders every week. If you have friends and it's a little hard for you to do that, give me an email and I'd be happy to share the Zoom link and then let the library know. So that email is gwcf@windstream.net. And the submission period is open for the next edition of the Grant Wood Country Chronicle. We have no line limit. You can use any form inspired by any aspect of the art, history, culture, and legend of icon Grant Wood and Grant Wood Country. And submissions are open to Iowans to submit to the new Grant Wood Country Ekphrastic Poetry category of this year's Iowa Poetry Association annual contest. And of course, they have other categories too. So you're encouraged to do that. Essays and short fiction. I would love to hear your thoughts about anything that you've experienced and been inspired or thought about because of this forum, or because you went out and researched some things about Grant Wood yourself. Do not worry about whether it's perfect. That's what editors are for. We want to hear your voice. So anytime you want to submit something and talk about it, just bring it on. Also, be sure to check out the Cedar Rapids Public Library's YouTube channel for recordings of these sessions, and feel free to share those freely. And we have a Facebook page called Grant Wood Country Forum, so feel free to like and share that as well, and kind of keep up with some goings on. And if you would like a complimentary copy of the most recent Grant Wood Country Chronicle, email me your mailing address and I'd be happy to mail you one free of charge. Again, that email is gwcf@windstream.net. And I do apologize in advance if there's any audio troubles. We did have some troubles, connectivity type things that happened last time. Hopefully we don't usually have those. So I'm hoping we'll get past that this time. What we'll do is we'll try to keep everybody muted, just one person talking at a time, to see if that helps. And Zoom screen share is enabled for all presenters and participants, yet there's just some some compatibility things or something that isn't quite working on my Mac tonight, so I couldn't share. So, but I think Dawn's going to be able to share, and I trust that Joe is probably going to be able to share his slides for sure. So, so without further ado, let's, Linda Peterson, would you like to follow up from last week's session?
Sure. Excuse me. Yes, definitely.
Oh, that'd be so fun.
I thought the limericks were such fun. I've always been a fan of them. And I jotted a few ideas down and then went to bed, and my head was rolling, and I ended up getting up and going out to the computer and typing a while before I actually went to sleep. So I've got several that I'd love to share. The first is called The Appraisal. Miss Chicken is too old to set. She's certainly nobody's pet. The women agree to a right amount fee. Now, Miss Chickens with noodles, I bet. The second one, Woman with Plant. There once was an artist named Grant. He went off on a bit of a rant. J. Sigmund said, whoa, just paint what you know. So he painted his mom with a plant. I've got two more. Lilies of the Alley. There once was an artist named Wood who worked with whatever he could. Metal and glass, paint, bits of brass, and the flowers stayed where they should. And the last one is for Steve. This is what from his presentation. The field work was going quite slow. The farmer had little to show. His horse was so lame. Then the new tractor came. Now the farmer can plow a quick row. That's it.
Those are so fun. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share and read this evening before we get started with Dawn's session? If not, we can circle back at the end of the evening too. So, Dawn, should we try this thing?
Let's do it. Okay. I am going to try. Give me just a moment to get things up and going. There we go. And do you see it? Poetic forms.
I see it.
Okay. If you see it, I bet others do too. I'm going to try the slideshow now. How's that? Do you see that as a slideshow? Great.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I'm just going to throw a question out there. How many, and I can't see everybody, but I'm just going to, Elaine, you can speak for the group. So remember when you studied Iowa history, when it was Iowa History Day, when you were in like 4th grade, and you're going to have like a special event and you were asked to dress in like, you know, pioneer clothing or clothing from a certain period and maybe bring certain food that would have been eaten at that time. Wasn't that just fun? The fact that you were, you know, putting yourself as much as you could in your 4th grade world in the shoes of people who came before. So I just want you to kind of think about that. Put on your 1920s. Oh, and I know it says 1985. That's going to be 1985. The more contemporary will be next time. But we're going to really focus on 1920 to 1935 and look at the poetry that was being written at the time, and especially with poets who were local to Iowa. I have one woman in there who is from Chicago that we're going to look at some of her work a little bit. But I want you to think about, you know, historically, these are the forms that were being used. And you might ask, well, why these forms? There's, a lot of contemplation about why these forms. I mean, these forms, we've talked about the sonnet, we've talked about, rhyming quatrains, we've talked about, couplets. There's villanelles, there's a variety of forms that were being used, and forms were being used along with content to best reflect the subject that was being described. So form and content, they were as important then as they are now. And you will see how that works a little bit, and just some quick examples that I have here. So I'm going to be sharing, these are primarily examples that I found from the Poetry Foundation. So I know many of you out there who are poets, you have seen Poetry Magazine. It's probably one of the most sought out publication platforms in all of poetry. This is what it looked like back in the day, folks. This is from 1926. I love this. And I was just going out there and I was doing a search on some particular poets, and we're going to talk about some of them. And I also have a book that I'm going to spend some more time talking about next time, called Iowa Poets. It was published in 1935. I do have an example in this evening's presentation, but I'll spend more time talking about that next time, especially the frontispiece that was written, that was drawn by Grant Wood. It's so much fun. And then just look at what the Iowa Authors Club looked like in 1935. I think it's the predecessor of the Iowa Poetry Association, which is 77 years old. So anyway, we'll more on that next time. But this time we're going to start with a poem by J. Sigmund called Taxidermist, and I will read it. And I want you to listen to how I read it. I haven't practiced it nearly enough, but there's some important things that we're going to be talking about this poem as we think about the poetry of the time. Taxidermist. To him, it was a tragic thing for mole or grouse or brant to die, and all the husks of slaughtered teal he wanted kept close by. He seemed to think the souls of quail would flutter back to mounted skins, and by his strange and savage rites be purged of birdly sins. And in his smelly cobwebbed shop, he loved to sit when twilight fell, and for the few who spoke his tongue, strange tales he used to tell. The language that his soul preferred in street or in his bartering was much the same the grocer used when tying ends of string. But when he put his scalpel up and hung his apron by the stove, his talk was of the rail and turn that haunt the marshy cove. His mates were sunburned, hawk-eyed men who seldom worked and always owed, men who lived near heron roosts along the river road. And I know we've heard of the River Road as we talk about Grant Wood in at least one of his paintings. But is there anything that anybody notices about this poem that's perhaps different than the poems that we read today? And just shout it out, because I can't see you, but I can hear you. Anybody? Well, I'm going to call on Marilyn. Marilyn, what do you notice about this poem?
It's a metered poem. It's a lovely meter. So for the most part, it's octosyllabic, but the fourth line of each tercet has only 6 syllables. So it shortens up. And the rhyming scheme is held throughout the second and fourth lines of each. So I love it.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. So you heard some words that Marilyn used, octosyllabic. That means it has 8 syllables in each line, except for that final line of the quatrain. That fourth line is always 6 syllables. So that's a technique that Sigmund was using to hold this together. It was very common to have metered poems and to be to pay as much attention to that as to the rhyme. And Marilyn mentioned the rhyme on the second and fourth lines of every single quatrain. So that was pretty common in that time. And there would certainly be variations in rhyme scheme and how you used it, but also in meter. And I just wanted to go on to this next one and just show, just showing in that first stanza what that rhyme scheme looks like. I mean, there is no A rhyme, there is no C rhyme. I could have put X's there and A's for the second and fourth line, but just to show you, this is, not every line has to rhyme, but there has to be some way to hold this together, and that would be considered, a continuity in a poem. And I wanted to also show you this hot mess. So Marilyn was talking about the meter, and so this is a technique, and I was, of course, doing it on my iPad with my finger, which explains why it's really kind of hard to read. So this is scansion, and scansion is when you do a graphical representation of the metrical pattern of a line of verse. So when we talk about metered feet, we talk, you've heard from your days of studying Shakespeare, which was in probably 10th grade or 9th grade, that 2 syllables equals 1 metric foot. So if you're talking about iambic pentameter, iambs, that's a type of where the stress falls in those, with those words or with those syllables. So pentameter would be, there are 10 syllables or 5 feet in the line. So what I did here is as I start to study this poem and I'm thinking, how does this work? I'm looking at, okay, to him, it was a tragic thing. So you can see that sometimes the metrical foot falls, a single word doesn't occupy that foot. It's the syllables that are the thing. So it's perfectly iambic, means that an unstressed syllable is followed by a stressed syllable. Some people call this the heartbeat meter, because it is kind of like a heartbeat, and it goes boom, 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 boom. So you can think of it like that. And I am just amazed, especially with that fourth line, that it is in those quatrains in each stanza, it's almost always perfectly, the 3 feet, which is called trimeter, the 4 feet is called tetrameter. So you don't have to memorize any of that, but it's just like, okay, here's a technique for at least evaluating, this is an artifact of the time. And just like if we were finding an artifact in a barn, or we're an archaeologist, we would find a way to examine this. And as a poet, this is a way that we can do that. So if you found a poem that actually had the reverse of the iamb, that's a trochee. So it becomes trochaic verse. If you find 2 stressed syllables, usually you don't find something that's, stressed syllables all the way through, but it might be part of your meter. That's called a spondee. And then if you want to go on, and there's 3 beats, it might be anapestic, which is 2 unstressed and 1 stressed, or dactylian, which is 3 beats, or dactylic, I should say, 3 beats, 1 stressed and 2 unstressed. So that's just your little lesson in meter and scansion. But why is it important? It's because this was how poetry was represented at the time, and some of the finest poetry. So I want you to know, J. Sigmund, he didn't always see his poetry as being really very good, which is very interesting to me. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. And I asked Elaine, are we doing a J. Sigmund Paul Engel section this time? And we're not this time, but maybe next year. And I think it'd be a great topic. And I know that there are a couple of you, Barb and Dorothy, I don't know if you're on, I know that you're experts on this topic, but so we know that J. Sigmund was a very influential friend to Grant Wood, and he was all about this local, regional approach to poetry, art, any of the arts, really. And apparently he never traveled farther from Iowa than Chicago, and he simply brought his art home. He said, poetry is not a thing of far off places. You can see it, you can find it right at hand. He held that poetry exists in the daily living of a life, and that rhythm is the greatest scheme of things present, even in our pulse. So there's the word pulse that reminds us of heartbeat, that reminds us of iambic meter. All locales could yield their overtones if one is sensitive enough to register them. And I found this really interesting article it's on a website, but it was taken from Modern Age. And I will leave that website after I'm done with my presentation in the chat, because it's really interesting in the way that it talks about J. Sigmund and just his life as a poet, because we know that that's not what he did full time. He also was very sensitive about his work, because again, he did not go to school to be a poet. He was an insurance salesman. He was a darn good one. Actually, he shares that in common with Ted Kooser, who we'll talk about next time. But here's another example, and this is a poem that has within the quatrain stanza, you'll see a more regular rhyme scheme. And I'll just read the first few stanzas of this. This is called Christ in the Street. And this is definitely more religious or spiritual. He came to earth one blue sky day. He walked with worldmen down the street. The people stared in a wide-eyed way, nothing his wounded hand, noting, I think it should be noting, but this one says nothing, his wounded hands and feet. Then they whispered and hurried by. Some of them mockingly jibed and smiled when he stopped where buildings towered high to stroke the head of a ragged child. So it maintains this rhyme scheme throughout. I didn't do the metrical assessment, but I did just want to say that even, these spiritual poems, they were influenced locally also. And he has in the 30s, he has a definite period of religious poems, which was influenced by spending time with Trappist monks in the Dubuque area. So this article, again, that I have, I'll send it to you. It's called Bard of the Wapsipinicon, an assessment of J.G. Sigmund. So it's very interesting. So obviously, Sigmund, not the only person writing at the time. You don't find a lot of women, in the 20s and 30s that are being published by Poetry Magazine. And why do we think that is? I mean, who had the academic appointments? Who was, allowed agency to that type of education? Probably not a woman necessarily at this time, but Margaret Young was different. She did have access to that type of education. She was a novelist as well as a poet. And this one is called Ballad Loving. And so there's a really strong and beautiful meter in this. She was a ballad-loving woman who lived until she died. With a hey, lily loo, and a how low land, her sorry tears were dried. She watched the east, she watched the west, she watched the changing weather. With a hey, lily loo, and a how low land, she kept her heart together. So you can see that the first and third lines of each stanza, they don't rhyme. The second and fourth do, to kind of anchor that. But you also see the repetition almost all the way through. There's repetition of kind of a song, a refrain. And that was a very important part of poetry. And not that all of it had it, but it does refer back to a really old form, which is the ballad, kind of the lyric ballad. And it's very interesting how Marguerite does that here. And it's fun. It's also really kind of surface, but also ironic in many ways. So here we have James Hurst. How many are there people here who have heard of James Hurst, who is a famous Iowa poet? Okay, awesome. Well, he was a farmer. He grew up on the farm, and he thought that's what he was going to do until a diving accident made him a paraplegic when he was a very young man. was diving into the Cedar River and had this accident. But James Hurst became a very well-known farmer poet. He was one of the first, I believe, in the state of Iowa who used that term for himself, that he was a farmer poet. He was a professor, and he was at UNI, and he was one of the first Iowa editors when the North American Review, which is the oldest literary journal in the United States, when it was looking for a new home and it came to UNI. So this one was published in 1930 called Frost, and it uses that tighter ABAB rhyme scheme. And I'll just read it really quickly. It's a short poem. Though nothing came that could be heard, green turned yellow, and from no drought in my cornfield, and the last blackbird has swallowed his notes and drifted south. If the change is death, then the color and all of blood in the leaves, of smoke in the sky, has deceived me with beauty. I heard no call of roots to the sap, and no answering cry. It is time then for me to walk alone, to watch leaves fall while thought runs slow on the stubborn permanence found in stone, on the sharp, bright virtue of the plow. So again, we've got this very, pastoral scene. You can see this being written almost, if you think about some of the Grant Wood paintings and the beautiful landscape, this is really, it's a beautiful landscape poem. Even though it's about the changing of the seasons, right? The change is death, color and all, etc. So, again, think about form, function, how it all works together. And if you wanted to kind of dress up like you would for Iowa History Day, you could write a poem like this. Here's another one by Marguerite Young. And this is iambic tetrameter, and these are rhyming couplets. And I looked to see if there was a name for this kind of form, and the closest I could come is a couplet knell, but it's not exactly a couplet knell. So, people were using these forms in an interesting way. And this one is kind of satirical, right? I think I know who young Harry is, and I looked up when Harry Truman, when he was in politics, and he was a senator at this time. But the angels wept in their distress to see young Harry playing chess with Lucifer, the wily one, through moon's eclipse and burning dawn, until all things he had were lost, not bartered back at any cost, and all he would not have likewise was watched by speculative eyes. They mourned to see him in a trance, relinquishing each grave advance, immersed in thoughts of many things beyond the pawns, the queens and kings, in plaintive calls of whippoorwills that dripped from out the farthest hills, an old ballad, a witch's name, a wreath of smoke, but not the game. So is this one that is about wartime? Is this, there are many, I'm not sure exactly who Harry is, but when we talk about playing with Lucifer, we talk about they mourned him in a trance, relinquishing each grave advance. Grave is used. There's two ways that you could look at the use of the word grave. So think about again, form and content. This one, I love this. So this is this book that I found, this very special book published in 1935 called Iowa Poets, with a foreword by J. Sigmund and a frontispiece by Grant Wood. And this is by Paul Engel. And Paul Engel became the first director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. And he and his wife, they were very involved in the formation of it. But Paul Engel was very influenced by J. Sigmund. And Paul Engel, as I remember from last year's presentation, was J. Sigmund's paperboy. Maybe that's their first connection. And I know many of you out there probably know much more about this story, but I did want to show this very interesting sonnet format You know, Paul Engel was educated in writing at this point in his life in 1935. I'm not sure exactly where he was in that education, but I've seen this published in Iowa Poets and another similar sonnet in Poetry Magazine. But this is a very interesting form. And let me see, how much time do we have? I think this is one of my last ones. Okay, I think I have a little time. I'll read this. This is a sonnet, because we know it's 14 lines, right? 14 lines that indicate, and it's got a rhyme scheme to it. It's probably a sonnet. So let's read it. Into steps in the snow. And the other thing that you can think about when you're writing, if you choose to write a sonnet is an argument. There is the first part of the argument. There's a second part of the argument that's going to then lead to a conclusion. Into the night beyond the street lamp's flare, a man walks, crushing black holes in the snow. The shadows close about him while I stare. On the dark path he leaves. Where does he go? Into some house where laughing children play, clamoring to be taken on his knee. And a woman waits to know what he will say of meals and shows. And will they disagree? Or find a harlot's house and there renew memory of a woman till an hour is past? Or go into a lonely room and lie across a chair and smoke a pipe or two? Or wander through the bitter night at last to fall into an alleyway and die? Cheery poem. So just wanted you to see this rhyme scheme. So it does not have a rhyme scheme like an English sonnet or an Italian sonnet. Its rhyme scheme is, I have it over there at the side. And this is an Anglo-Italian sonnet. So it's got shades of both. Poets, you know, they were fooling around with rhyme. It's not that, you know, the Anglo-Italian sonnet, I'm sure it pre-existed this, but there are so many different kinds of sonnets. If you, I have a great book, great resource called Exhalation of Form that talks about the many, many forms of sonnets. And also Google's a good resource. Plug in a rhyme scheme, see what it comes up with. It might tell you something that's really interesting about these rhyme schemes. So this is in that book I showed you, and we'll go back to that book more next time. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Does anybody have any questions? I can see somebody that, oh, there we go. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't have any questions, but that was fabulous. As you've alluded to, I've been in love with J. Sigmund since I first came across him, and it's amazing to me that he was able to do these patterns and such, because he's definitely self-made. He didn't even graduate from high school, so it's just perfect, and I love learning all this stuff. And you're right about Paul Engel being his paper boy. And I believe that Paul Engel was still in Europe in 1935, although I do not know. And it's interesting to read some of the letters he wrote back to J. Sigmund at that time, because that's when Hitler was coming into power. So it's very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barb. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the comments. You know, and what also strikes me too about J. Sigmund is that he tried the new style of the time, which was just coming in. It was free verse, and he just said, "I can't do this. I can't do this free verse thing." And you know, obviously, he wasn't alone. There weren't a lot of people writing free verse, perhaps at that time. So anyway. I think it's amazing and fantastic, and I want to celebrate his publications in Poetry Magazine, because that's kind of the ultimate. It was then and it is now. So he should feel I hope he felt accomplished with his poetry. So yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I don't know if there's a way to save that somewhere, Elaine, but
Save the what?
The presentation, just if anybody's interested.
I did take some screenshots of the
Okay.
poems.
Okay.
If you would like me to share those out.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we can, or I can just even share the link to my own. I'll share my link. I'll share the link to that. And
Yeah.
so next time I will be looking at the Iowa Poets Anthology from 1935, but I'm also going to advance it into other Midwestern poets that are a little bit more contemporary. We're going to look at the American sonnet, which is very contemporary form, and how you might want to incorporate maybe an American sonnet or a triolet, which is an old form, but it's, kind of, it's a neo-formalist form that people are using now. And so anyway, forms, I love forms. It's always fun. And I'll stop. So thank you so much.
Well, we
May I-
love your, Dawn, thank you so much. We love your enthusiasm. Sylvia.
I stumbled upon the red
You
cover.
got it too?
I have it. I got it at, I think, our public library sale. And I got it for $25 or less. And I just love it. And I was so surprised to find there's a poem in here by a woman whose name is, hang on just a second. I had it marked, Ethel Blythe Penningroth, and she writes about, she's a farm wife. So my cousin married Bill Blythe, who is her nephew. And so it was just like, oh my gosh, all roads lead to poetry. But
Absolutely.
it's just so wonderful. And there's also some poems in this one by Ed Rowan, whose name is going to be coming up next week for sure, maybe this week. And then
Fabulous.
Barb Feller and I have found a limerick that Grant Wood wrote. And
Oh.
she'll share that with you, though, when we talk about daughters of that. But
That's
I don't know if we're free to include that in our, I don't know what copyrights are. But anyway, yes, thank you. This was wonderful. I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much. And
So-
somebody in the chat said that they're related to one of the people that you mentioned. So it is a small world.
Deb said that. Oh my gosh. Well,
Oh,
you
Debbie,
know,
I'm related to some people with the last name of Blythe. So maybe Sylvia and I
maybe.
are related. We'll have to check that
Okay.
ancestry.
We're going to
They
have to
are-
talk some
And
more.
they are in Iowa, so
Yeah. About
I love
Williamsburg.
we'll have to
yes.
check it out.
Okay.
That's
Thanks.
great. Thanks so much, everybody.
Oh my gosh, isn't that fun? And I actually have a couple collections of poetry by a woman named Emma Safely, who also was a artist. And she not only did paintings, but she painted on china, and she published a couple collections of poetry. She lived in Springville. And they had featured her at an event not terribly long ago, I think in Marion. And so I have a couple of her books, and I'm like, I'm going to try to find the family, but I don't think there's any to find. And because I was hoping to reprint some of her things because it was just so localized, So, I mean, it goes on and on. You find one connection and it leads to another, and so that is that's why this forum just keeps going, because the connections keep going. And speaking of that, so thank you again, Dawn, and feel free to chat each other up and email each other and do all those sorts of things. So thank you again, Dawn. We'll look forward to next week. And one thing I want to do while introducing Joe is I want to remind folks what a wonderful book this is by Sue Taylor from 2020 called Grant Wood Secrets. Yes, and I want to show you this front piece because, oh my gosh, who supplied that to Sue for this book? Could that have been from the Joe Coffey collection? Yes, it was. And actually I found that out later, Joe, because I was like, here's the book, it's got all these Post-its in it, and it's like, that's my Grant Wood Bible, right? For me. And I looked a little more closely at it. I'm like, oh, for crying out loud, nobody told me that. So that was so fun. But I encourage everybody to engage this book. And so before we get going with you, Joe, I would love for people to know a little bit more about you, your connection to Grant Wood, to Cedar Rapids, maybe even Iowa City, a little bit of your background, kind of the windy way you got to this moment, connecting with us so ardently all the way from Chicago, which of course it's got a taste of Grant Wood over there too. But so anyway, if you would be comfortable, just don't be shy. I would love to brag on how deep and wide your interest and enthusiasm is. But so anyway.
You're very kind. A lot of it is happenstance. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas. My undergraduate degree is in telecommunications of all things. That word used to mean radio, TV, film, broadcast back in the day. Ended up in TV news, and a few gigs into that career. I was at KCRG in Cedar Rapids. I was the weekend anchor. And like any journalist in Eastern Iowa, you occasionally do stories connected to Grant Wood. And I guess the neighborhood I lived in on the southeast side, a couple of different homes, I realized that I was surrounded by people with Grant Wood in their homes and stories. And then walking my dog, I'd realize, oh, that house looks familiar. Sure enough, that's the one in a famous Grant Wood painting. And just all the connections everywhere. I just kind of got deeper and deeper, and it became somewhat of a hobby / passion because I just really connect with his work, and to understand the context, and we'll get into that tonight, of what was happening in the times, the zeitgeist of what was in the air in literary circles and art circles and criticism circles and in pop culture. Why what he did took off and resonated with some folks, made some folks mad, and trying to understand, oh, he was like Geppetto the puppeteer. He knew what he was doing, and he was playing it right down the middle for effect. And there was just, I thought he was a genius. So the more I looked into it, the next thing you know, I go to grad school and do some other things. And I was freelancing for a while for the History Center there in the old mansion, and got a chance to swim around in the archives there and come across some neat artifacts and publish some pieces. And next thing you know, another thing leads to another, and I've got quite a trail of research that I've come across and share with. I'm recognizing a lot of faces on the grid here. We're constantly emailing each other, sharing tips and tidbits, and oh, who is this? Do you recognize this guy? Or have you seen this? And as we connect dots and kind of push things forward and publish new pieces and write stories, it's just fun to be connected. So thanks to you, Elaine, for spearheading this whole thing and making it happen. And hey, thanks to the Cedar Rapids Public Library. You know, as Dawn was talking, it reminded me earlier last week in finishing touches on this presentation tonight. I'm swimming around in 1930s Gazette articles, and I keep coming across random poems by, Paul Engel and Jay Sigmund. They put them in the Gazette all the time. So don't forget, it can be kind of hard to find some online, but if you go to the Cedar Rapids Public Library, go to the archives page, the newspaper archives, get in there, start swimming around. The searches, it takes a while to get used to, but once you're used to it, search out these Iowa poets by name, because the Gazette was constantly publishing their work, just randomly fill in the corner of a page next to other news. So it's a lot of fun. You can find some neat stuff that way. Well, I will dig into the presentation here, and thanks for your patience as I get set. I'm going to ask if you can see screens and all of that stuff, and hopefully things will work out. So let me get all my right buttons pressed here. So I'm going to hit presenter view, and let me know, do you now have a full screen of a faded postcard of Cedar Rapids? Is that what you see? Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for your interest in this talk. I'm glad everybody's on the screen. This is going to be fun. I call this talk The City versus Grant Wood, How Cultural Constructions of City Identity Shaped Grant Wood and His Art. So I was asked to talk about city life in Cedar Rapids in, Grant Wood's time. And I couldn't resist. I had to connect some dots. And so we're going to do that together tonight. And I think you'll find this fun. So we're going to talk about city life and identity, what Cedar Rapids city life had to offer, the role of cities as an identity in pre-World War II America. Our focus is on Cedar Rapids, but we're also going to take a peek at Paris, France. We're going to talk about how city identity, or the lack of it, gives context to and shapes Grant Wood's art. It propelled him into the regionalist movement, which was actually quite complicated for him. It seems like an easy fit, but it was actually very complicated. And we're going to play around with critical cultural theory, the basics. We're going to take one theory, and I'm going to show you how it can be a very helpful tool for understanding the artistic artifacts that Wood gave to the world. So I'm going to end my PowerPoint here and go to a slide. I'm going to press play on an old film. Some of you in this forum saw bits of this last year. The History Center unearthed some pretty neat footage, and I think it goes well. If we're going to talk about life in the 30s in Cedar Rapids, we might as well see it. So while this plays, I'll give you some background. I think it helps answer the question, what is a city anyway? This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It's like a time capsule. This footage was found at the History Center. I really enjoy working with those guys. I highly encourage you to become a member. Their archives are formidable. Their building is historic, amazing, and very important to the Grant Wood story. Their programming is great. I consider them dear friends, and they would love to help you with your research. Curator Tara Templeman and I produced a documentary from this film and a bunch of other films that they found over the past few years. It's called Films from the Attic, Volume 1, and it is available in the gift shop. Thanks to them for giving us permission to put this footage in the Zoom meeting here tonight and on YouTube for the Cedar Rapids Public Library. So what you see here is 16mm silent film, digitized, cleaned up, and I slowed it down to correct that quirky motion, that off-speed movement that you see when they play back old films. I tried to make it look more realistic. There's a lot to take in here, as you can see. This is what life looked like downtown in a Midwestern city of decent size in the 30s. As I think most of you know, if not all of you, downtown Cedar Rapids today, at its busiest hour during the week, looks nothing like this. It's more of a ghost town compared to what you see here. This footage is from June 1938, either June 14th, 15th, or 16th. And I know this because I was pressing pause a lot, zooming in, and I was looking at marquees on theaters. And the Iowa Theater, you could see on the marquee, there was the name of 3 different films. One was a Hitchcock film, The Girl Was Young. One was The Marines Are Here, and the other was The March of Time. So through the Cedar Rapids Public Library's newspaper archives and searching those film titles, I was able to zero in, and there were those 3 days where those films were being shown. So that's how we know exactly when this film was shot. Let's talk about the Iowa Theater building, which is now TCR. That was on 3rd Street, right by First Avenue. TCR's had several names over the years. It was the CRCT, the Cedar Rapids Community Theater. They were known for the names of the players for a while, the Footlighters and the Community Players. And they started off being known as the Little Theater. And this started in Grant Wood's home and studio at 5 Turner Alley in 1925. If you get this DVD, you're going to have fun pressing pause, zooming in. You'll recognize a lot of these streets. A lot like that right there. Used to be Merchants National Bank. It's US Bank now. There's Quaker in the background. You'll recognize a lot of this. And it's just so fun to see the hustle bustle. There's the Roosevelt Hotel looking north on First. And there's Mays Island and City Hall. There's so much to take in, and so much of it is still there today. There's even a shot, I already saw it pass by, of a curious looking guy. And I'm like, I know I've seen this guy before. And a lot of you on this forum, there's an email thread, and you're all helping me figure out who that guy is. And I think we're getting close. We're going to figure out who that is. But wouldn't it be neat to just see Grant Wood walking by? We actually know that that's kind of a long shot because this was shot in 1938. And Grant Wood left Cedar Rapids just a few years earlier. So let's go back in time to 1935. I'm going to assume downtown Cedar Rapids didn't look too different just 3 years earlier, but I think 1935 is a good benchmark to really get a feel for the decade. In 1935, the population of Cedar Rapids was 56,500. There were 15,600 telephones installed in the city. The entire city limits were comprised of 28 square miles. There were 5 banks, 1 daily paper, and 3 weeklies. There were actually 8 theaters: the Colonial, the Iowa, the Majestic, the Olympic, the Palace, the Paramount, the Rialto, and the State. There were 2 hospitals, St. Luke's and Mount Mercy, 86 barbershops, 56 beauty shops, 71 beer taverns, 1 public bowling alley, 1 private golf course. There were 4 6-year high schools, 18 ward schools, 6 parochial schools. There was 1 college, Coe, 1 junior college, Mount Mercy, 2 professional schools, the Cedar Rapids Business College and Dickinson Secretarial School. There were 3 libraries. Together, they held 140,000 books: the Masonic Library, the Coe Library, and the Public Library, which actually had 5 satellite branches all over the city. The fire department employed 58 men. The police department employed 55. There were still 2 blacksmiths. There were 14 auto dealers, 3 used car lots, 119 gas stations, 57 auto mechanic shops, 5 bicycle dealers, 14 tobacco shops, and get this, there were almost 100 attorneys, and there were more than 100 insurance men. 16 jewelers were in town. There were 2 pawnbrokers, 8 photographers, 22 printers, 1 radio station. The tower was right there on one of the buildings on First Avenue. There were 34 shoe repair shops. 60 clergymen worked at 58 different churches. There were 37 coal dealers, 14 department stores, and 5 and dime retailers. There were 12 florists, 7 retail furriers, 19 hotels, and 215 grocers. All right, I'm going to stop this and go back now. So I want to talk about grocers for a second, because I think that's a pretty good way to get a feel of what life was really like back then. They were on every other block before neighborhoods grew into what we think of now as a neighborhood being. Today, we don't think twice about a neighborhood being blocks and blocks and blocks of nothing but houses, no businesses. But back then, there were these grocery stores all over the place, often on corners. So what you're looking at is a 1932 photo of Meineke Grocers at 821 3rd Avenue Southwest. P. Meineke Groceries and Meats started in 1896 when the OG Meinekes bought an existing store. They got the store, the inventory, and the land for $250. In the 30s, grocers still worked like the old general stores that they evolved from. You handed your list over to the owner or the clerk at the desk, and they'd turn around and go get your stuff. You'd carry it home in a box. They knew everyone on the block. In fact, you could often buy on credit, pay your bill after you got paid. They mostly had non-perishables and grains. By 1935, some grocers were selling meat and produce. There were still 7 standalone produce stores and 16 standalone butcher shops in Cedar Rapids in 1935. But remember, times were kind of tough. In the 30s, the U.S. economy hit grocers pretty hard. A trade magazine at the time that I found noted that retail grocer sales nationwide declined 49% from 1929 to 1933. Here's a photo of Abraham's Grocery at 512 5th Avenue Southeast. This was in the Lebanese and Syrian neighborhood, which comprised most of the area between downtown and Oak Hill Cemetery at the time. We don't talk about this enough when we talk about the history of Cedar Rapids. More than 100 Lebanese Syrian-owned businesses were in operation in the 30s. They were mostly store-type front businesses, grocers, cafes, dry goods, and shoe repair stores, things like that. Several Lebanese Syrian-owned companies involved wholesaling goods that were sold to retail stores all over the Midwest. That wholesaling trade grew out of the traveling sales trade, commonly referred to as peddling back in the day. If you made it big as a peddler, then you started supplying goods for other peddlers. So this whole concept of wholesaling goods, there was a word for that. That was called the jobber's trade. When you look through a lot of really old magazines and newspapers, you'll see references to jobbers and jobbing and job ads for the jobber's trade. And that's what that is, wholesaling. So the grocery store, as we know it today, was kind of in its earliest stages. Piggly Wiggly was figuring out the business model in the Memphis area starting in the 1910s. King Cullen opened in Long Island in 1930. Albertsons followed suit by the 40s. Cedar Rapids held on to this neighborhood grocer thing for a long time, longer than most American towns. The Me Too supermarkets ushered in the supermarket era in Cedar Rapids. The first one opened in 1960. So hats were still a very common element of city life in the 1930s. Everyone had hats in 1935, but technically they were just a little bit past the peak of the hat era. There were 3 men's hat stores and 8 millinery shops of women's hats in 1935. It was becoming more common for general clothing stores to carry hats, like you see in this Killian ad here. Now, consider that there were 12 milliners listed in the Cedar Rapids directories as early as 1912, and 12 milliners listed as late as 1928. So back to jobbers for a moment. Jobbing was a fairly common area of business until the 30s, and the wholesaling of hats is a good example of it. It was a notable part of Cedar Rapids business history in the early part of the century. One of the biggest women's hats wholesalers in the country, Lyman Brothers, was located in Cedar Rapids. They employed more than 75 people at their peak. In 1915, they built the 7-story Iowa building at the corner of 4th Avenue and 3rd Street Southeast. And what you're looking at here, this is a shot from inside that building. The company wound down in the late 20s. You could say 2 main things led to the demise of the hat industry: Audubon and automobiles. The Audubon Society advocated for the protection of birds. Exotic feathers were a must-have fashion element in ladies' hats at the turn of the century. It took a while to go away, and it was the Audubon Society that made that happen. And of course, the automobile made hats less common. It was simply hard to get in and out of a car with a hat on. So as cars became more common, formal hats, casual hats, and business hats became less common. So let's go to 1930. American Gothic wins a prize at the Art Institute of Chicago. Until this point, photos in newspapers were terrible. Spend some time in the archives. It's amazing. You saw them. They were little sketches, but they were terrible. But then technology changed. As papers across the country adapted to new printing technology, newspaper editors were clamoring for more photos to run. So the editors loved stuff like this, what you see right here, an aggregated collection of photos, all newsworthy, from a service. And they came ready to go. Running a page like this was a big deal. Suddenly, they could visually show readers stuff from all over the country and all over the world. Now, this is a big part of Grant Wood's story that I think is often overlooked, the timing of this. It was the timing of technology, the role of photo engraving. There was a company in Cedar Rapids called True Art, and they kind of got him involved in a lot of these plates that got shown all over the country. It was the timing of American Gothic winning a prize. It was the timing of this new, faster kind of collective zeitgeist in which Americans across the country simply reading newspapers, not scholars, mind you, not art critics, but regular Americans looking at newspapers, all seeing the same recently painted paintings at almost the same time. Here's what the caption says. I don't know if you could read it, so I'll read it for you. American Gothic, this Nebraska homesteader and his Swedish wife gaze down upon the thousands who view the display of American painting and sculpture at the Chicago Art Institute. The painting, entitled American Gothic, which has drawn the praise of critics, is the work of Grant Wood, young artist of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who was a student at the Institute. So to understand the hubbub at the time, forget the color image of that famous painting that you have in your head. Forget it for a moment. Consider that photo right there on your screen. It's in black and white. The shades of gray are gone. Those shades are almost black now. This is literally monochromatic. The facial shadows are ominous. The house is more white, more churchy looking. The tines of the pitchfork are even thinner, looking more dangerous, more devilish. McKeeby's gaze is threatening and it's directed right at you, the viewer. It's like a warning to not ask questions. Look at Nan, she's gazing off into the distance. It's almost as if she's missing her moment to ask for help. Her apparel suggests she's playing along with the setting, but her expression raises so many questions, right? And remember, she's a Swedish wife, according to the caption. And look at her, she's obviously way younger than the pitchfork rattling farmer. And think about the title, American Gothic. That suggests a religious fervor within a founding element of America, middle America, the salt of the earth place of in-betweens, in between both coasts, in between dressed down and formal. He's not wearing a tie. In between hardscrabble homesteading roots and an attempt to be as modern as the modernized parts of the country. All right, let's dip our toe into the pool of critical and cultural theory. This is basically a research area dedicated to the critically motivated study of cultural artifacts and practices, artworks, literary and philosophical texts, media technologies, and social and political practices are at the heart of this research. So you'll hear this referred to as critical and cultural theory, critical cultural studies, critical theory, culture theory, the Frankfurt School. There are a few other names. It basically involves various ways of understanding things and applying those ways to understand other things. It's using theories and ways of interpreting as lenses. So it's taking those lenses and looking at artifacts and trying to understand them better. That's it in a nutshell. This area of study draws from and is related to a number of other pockets of academic disciplines like mass communication theory, sociology, psychology, the humanities. It's a very interpretive analysis, really. So you see it applied to American studies, art. They have their own version of criticism, but you see this applied to art a lot, film, and even architecture. Interestingly enough, the University of Iowa, where Grant Wood taught art, emerged as a leader in critical cultural theory. Specifically, the university's School of Journalism and Mass Communication is well known for its academic chops in this area. There on your screen, this is what the department's building looks like today. Undergrads here work at the Daily Iowan, the school newspaper, and they participate in the campus TV station operation. If you go to grad school here, your North Star canon has less to do with Woodward and Bernstein, Cronkite, Brinkley, Brokaw, Jennings, and Couric, and more to do with Marcuse, Adorno, Benjamin, Fromm, Horkheimer, Foucault, Goffman, and Marshall McLuhan. This is the building that housed much of the J School for a long time. This is where my grad student office was when I was working on a master's and a PhD there in the program in the early 2000s. This is Seashore Hall, and it's named after Carl Sjöstrand, a Swedish Iowan who took the name Carl Seashore. By the way, for the record, I did spend 2 years in the PhD program and I taught undergrad classes, but I did not finish. I got a job offer, an offer I couldn't refuse, so I left academia. And as you can imagine, my parents were really happy about that. But anyway, such is life. So this is Carl Seashore on the left, depicted by Grant Wood in his 1938 lithograph, Honorary Degree. In 1897, Seashore was hired by the U of I to teach philosophy. He was running the Department of Philosophy and Psychology by 1905. He became the first dean of the U of I Graduate College in 1908. He retired in 1937, right before Wood did this lithograph. Seashore was a pioneer in the fields of speech pathology and audiology. He was instrumental in putting psychology on the map as a universally recognized science. He wrote 273 articles and books. Wood made his honorary degree lithograph after he started receiving his own honorary degrees from colleges. So it was a tongue-in-cheek, self-effacing gesture, picturing himself as rotund and awkward in the face of such an academic giant as Carl Seashore. The man directly behind Wood is Norman Foerster, an Iowa faculty member with 5 degrees, including a doctorate from Harvard. Remember, Wood caught flack at the U of I for not being a so-called man of letters. You can see how this lithograph is a response to that, albeit a self-effacing one. Note the wink, wink nod to American Gothic in the window behind them and in the hood that's destined for Wood's neck. The suggestion is that American Gothic got him that far, but hung over his head and will stay with him and might even choke him. On the right is a bronze bust of C. Shore housed in the psychology department at Gustavus College in St. Paul, Minnesota. An identical plaster bust is in the University of Iowa archives. So back to critical cultural theory. We're going to learn a theory here and how to use it to better understand Grant Wood. Check this out. I love this guy. Erving Goffman came up with a tidy little theory about identity that we can use as a lens. Goffman basically said, we all construct our own identity. This is the identity that we want others to see. However, this person we put together may not be the person that people see. Think about that. So what they pick up might not be what you're putting down. We craft an identity. We do this every day through our clothing, how we carry ourselves, what we say, how we act. It's a vision of intent. We just think we're being ourselves, but it really is a vision of intent. But Goffman raises the question, this thing you're putting out there, is that what people are picking up? That's the big question. So for example, just because I might put on Justin Roper boots, Wranglers, a Western shirt, and a Stetson hat and drive a Ford 150, that doesn't mean I'm a cowboy. People might look at me and chances are they're not going to see a cowboy. They're going to see a half Japanese history nerd trying to look like a cowboy. And for the record, I do not have that outfit anymore. Although I did once, but that's another story. We'll get into that at another time. Goffman's book came out in 1956, so Grant Wood was not familiar with it. It didn't exist yet. But it's clear to me that Grant Wood did put a lot of thought into the concept of identity. It's clear to me that Grant Wood played around with identity for effect, and I would say he was quite effective at it. Overalls are handy for painting and the mess involved, sure. But in Grant Wood's case, overalls were a connection to a particular identity. I mean, can you sell this painting and more like them to a buyer if you look like this? Grant Wood wasn't just selling paintings, he was selling the idea of himself being authentically connected to the subject matter of his paintings. In one of the talks, Sean Ulmer, Cedar Rapids Art Museum director, once said in a forum here with us, he said, there's a pretty good chance Grant Wood didn't milk a cow past the age of 10. But that didn't matter. Wood was fond of telling interviewers that he got his best ideas while milking cows. As you know, they ate it up. The country farmer guy thing became a part of his identity. He wore the overalls all the time when there was a chance that he would be photographed or if he could sell a painting. It was seamless with the art that he was creating, the art that he sold anyway. So remember, what you see here in the film from a moment ago is Cedar Rapids in the 30s. Wood lived 5 blocks from this exact spot where this guy is standing. Grant Wood was a city guy by any measure. All right, so what do you say we take a trip to Paris in the 1920s? This will be fun. Can everybody see the film? Is the screen working out there? Nod if you can see it. Okay. So like any artist at the time who was trying to make it big in the art world, Grant Wood went to Paris. It was an act of study, practicing his craft, trying to sell some art there, taking in the culture. It was all part of being an artist in the 1920s. Ernest Hemingway and a group of American writers famously took refuge in Paris in the 20s. They were known as the Lost Generation. You see, they came of age during the First World War. They inherited their parents' values, but they wanted more. The down-home values embedded in the little American provinces weren't bad. They just wanted more. They wanted to question them. They wanted to bend and break the rules. They wanted to explore art. They wanted to explore different ways of life. So this is where they came. You're looking at footage of Paris in the 1920s. Grant Wood went to Paris several times in the 20s, and he stayed for months. Here's a fun thought. Look at this shot. Wouldn't it be fun to spot Grant Wood in this archival footage? Wouldn't that be cool? Just sitting at a table, being a part of the scene. Wood was 8 years older than Hemingway, but he felt the same pull. He wanted to go somewhere to get out of the city, to get out of his city anyway, Cedar Rapids, and the identity that he crafted for himself there. He wanted to experience a different culture and be whoever he wanted to be, because he could be whoever he wanted to be if and when he was in Paris. All right, let's go back to our slides here. This is Grant Wood in Paris. He's not buttoned up. There's no chic formal fashion here like in the footage you saw earlier. His shirt is open. Look at his whiskers. He's got a hefty mug of beer. He's not drinking wine. Dare we say Grant Wood was playing around with another identity. The bohemian crowd in Paris was artsy, avant-garde, and daring. That's what Hemingway's Lost Generation crowd came for, and they loved it, more so than the prim and proper street cafe scenes that we saw just a moment ago. They were breaking rules and conventions. They were playing around with gender. They were daring not to conform to normative performances of identity. So check this out. 2 weeks ago here in Chicago, I attended a talk on Salvador Dali. There was a guy there. His name was Greg Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. He's a scholar consultant. He founded a company called the Triad Art Group, and he's quite an expert on Dali. I thought of Grant Wood when Bloch talked about Dali's persona, that wacky, artsy, larger-than-life personality that embodied his art. Bloch said Dali was nothing like that if no one else was in the room. It was a persona that made sense for the art that he gave the world. Bloch also talked about Andy Warhol's public persona, how Warhol wasn't really like the person that the world saw. Bloch did not mention Grant Wood, but I think he could have. Is it a shock that artists find themselves playing around with identity? Frida Kahlo dressed as a man and had fun with it. I'm going to quote my good friend Tom Hovren here. He's a dear friend, a U of I educated artist and a big fan of Grant Wood. Here's Tom's take on this situation. Art artists, art scholars, and art enthusiasts, we conduct this ritual. It's the learning and the teaching of how humans need to transect things. We transect cultural, societal, and religious norms, not just to propel our species forward, but to, ironically, care for us through the evolutionary changes. It's the fulcrum point of the scale and the magnetic core of everything. Along with all of the other study and expressions of humanity, it reins in this constant holy war and holy politics. Tom is a keen cultural observer. He says this is a large part of why trans and drag is such a hot button issue right now, and gender fluidity. People want to transect norms in a beautifully transactional yet healthy and harmless way. What Dali, Warhol, Grant Wood, Frida Kahlo, and so many of the artists do is drag. As participants of the arts and culture, we're all a part of this ritual too. Here's where things get sticky for Grant Wood. You're looking at a portrait of Thomas Craven. Craven was an art critic, a lecturer, and an author. He was instrumental in promoting the work of the regionalists. He was a big fan of them, and they liked him. This portrait was done by Thomas Hart Benton. He sang the praises of Thomas Hart Benton, John Stewart Curry, and Grant Wood for the most part. Like most critics, he offered some surprising swipes at his favorite artists from time to time, but overall, he was their champion. The only problem is he was highly problematic. His criticism imposed an overt preference for exaggerated heteronormative performances of gender. In his very influential 1934 book, Modern Art, the Men, the Movements, the Meaning, he basically lamented the loss of manliness in art. He associated art from France as being, quote, soft and pointless. He associated modernism with sexual deviance and gender confusion. Here's a bit from that book. The artist is losing his masculinity. The tendency of the Parisian system is to disestablish sexual characteristics, to merge the two sexes in an androgynous third, containing all that is offensive in both. Craven went after James McNeill Whistler, who died in 1903. You may recognize Whistler's name. He painted Arrangement in Gray and Black #1, better known as Whistler's Mother, which was widely considered an iconic, if not the most iconic work by an American painter at the time. That is, until American Gothic came along. Craven called Whistler that errant American ambassador from Bohemia to the Anglo-Saxons. And he said he painted without guts or substance. Whistler studied in Paris and embraced Bohemian culture, of course. Craven also blamed his perceived degradation of American art and culture on Whistler's friend, Oscar Wilde, an influential Irish playwright who died in 1900. Craven championed Thomas Hart Benton above all. He loved Benton. He loved Benton's manly themes. Benton showed the Midwestern countryside too, but often while including imagery of machines. To Craven, this showed progress, man and his machines, the land being controlled and further manipulated by the machinery of man. The beauty of the Midwest, the values, the hard work and all that stuff, that was there as man peacefully and humbly lived off the land. But the city was coming. The Midwestern cities were modernizing, and that was romantic to Craven and absolutely art-worthy, in other words. It was all in a favorable light, manly, and moving forward while preserving sacred notions about the heartland and those values the lost generation was so ready to let go of. Thomas Craven was trying to establish and defend the heartland's place in American art. So, as you can see, it's complicated. The hallowed values of small towns were being attacked by writers at this time after the 20th century, the turn of the century. It was a popular genre, in fact, referred to as revolt from the village or revolt against the provinces. The idea was to wreck Mayberry RFD, to use a pop culture from another time. The revolt from the village perspective said, don't embrace these little Midwestern villages, attack them, point out that they're not so good underneath it all. Pop the bubble. H.L. Mencken was a very popular editor and satirist. He was an atheist and really an elitist. He was a critic for the Hearst paper in New York City. He skewered notions of Midwestern down-home goodness, suggesting it was all a ruse. The so-called American village with its pleasant virtues was somewhat of a punching bag, satirized by E.W. Howe, Edgar Lee Masters, Upton Sinclair, Edith Wharton, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and most famously, Sinclair Lewis in Main Street. Main Street took the notion of Main Street America, set in the Midwest, in Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, actually, and turned it on its head. The facade of purportedly humble Midwestern homes were full of characters who weren't really trustworthy, and they didn't necessarily have the best intentions. The funny thing is, Grant Wood was game for this kind of thing. He loved it. He even illustrated a very popular version of Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. Wood was incredibly coy with this kind of criticism, though. It was right in his wheelhouse, but it was never quite completely overt and easy to understand for everybody. But it raised these questions. Was he making fun of the Midwest? If it's unclear, well, that's a good place to be. That's where he wanted to be. A lot of people in the Midwest were upset by American Gothic, especially in Cedar Rapids. Was it highbrow criticism with an intellectual bent that ultimately hurt the good people around him? He was, after all, the product of these places and these people. He knew them better than anyone, so you could say it was fair game. He just had to play coy about the whole thing. Grant Wood knew how to poke fun of people and things, institutions that were considered sacred. Sometimes the poke in the eye was easy to miss, which must have cracked him up, I believe. He was operating on another level. Sometimes he blurred the lines between celebrating the sacred and questioning if things really are what we were told they were. He had artistic license on his side. He could mask criticism as whimsy and fantastical art. So you can see the tough place Wood found himself in when it comes to this regionalism thing. His depictions of the Midwest won favor with anybody celebrating the notion of Middle Western America as being art-minded and art-worthy. Of course, he was down with that. But his art certainly wasn't manly. In fact, it was full of coded information that challenged what Craven was trying to trumpet about regionalism. Wood's identity by this point was a carefully crafted construction, obscuring notions of being different, The city was not a part of his art outside of some early commissions. His fanciful depictions of the country were far from manly compared to what his regionalist counterparts were doing. Consider Wood's Spring in the Country there on the left, and that's John Stewart Curry's Our Good Earth on the right. In terms of performances of gender, it's quite a difference there. 1935 is also the year Grant Wood painted this, Return from Bohemia. It was supposed to be the cover for his autobiography. The title says a lot, especially in light of our discussion here. Grant loved his trips to Paris in the 20s. He loved the bohemian lifestyle. He didn't get famous beyond his hometown, however, until he painted his Midwestern surroundings. He returned from Bohemia, so to speak. Notice the in-between nature of the painting. He's not wearing overalls. The transition back isn't quite complete yet. He's looking at the viewer, surrounded by the subjects he's supposed to paint in the Midwest. They're modernizing too, but there's a barn in the back. An older woman looks like what you'd expect to see in a Grant Wood painting. They're all looking down though, as if to say, don't look too closely, just do what you've got to do and get on with it. As it turns out, Wood did not finish the book. Most of the world didn't see it until Sue Taylor put it in the back of her book. That's the book that Elaine mentioned earlier. R. Tripp Evans argues that regionalism was quite complicated for Grant Wood. Wood went along with the hubbub, but he wasn't really playing by Craven's rules. He was friends with Thomas Hart Benton, and Benton didn't mind making men manly heroes in his work and emphasizing heteronormative stereotypes and themes of man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus machine. Those themes played well with xenophobic politics, actually. Conservative undertones catered to a kind of nationalism at the time, and it was clearly far from the politics that Grant Wood espoused. His only painting in 1935 was Death on Ridge Road, which Evans chose as the cover of his book. A lot of critics will say this painting is a critique of regionalism. The once beautiful countryside is worked over due to man's presence. And man is milliseconds away from losing the man versus machine conflict that was increasingly transforming the Midwest. Wood didn't mind taking shots at, or at least raising questions about what was supposed to be celebrated, or hiding very unexpected coded notions that those not in the know would completely miss. He was largely celebrated as a regionalist, though. Why not take cover when it's being provided for you? That same year, Wood published a mini book, a manifesto of sorts called Revolt Against the City. You could say it was anti-urban and anti-revolt from the village at the same time. It cried foul against art critics from New York City. It celebrates the simple complexities of the Midwestern farmer without suggesting the construct is a ruse. Overall, it's an interesting contribution to this revolt from the village and regionalist art discourses. Grant Wood is listed as the writer, and Frank Luther Mott is listed as the editor, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Frank Mott actually wrote the whole thing. He was a faculty member at the University of Iowa. So where does that leave us? Consider this. City versus country was the theme of Wood's last paintings. This was the dichotomy that Wood wrestled with his entire professional career once it got up and running. It boxed him in. He worked within it, albeit on a subversive level that we didn't really understand for a very long time. Here you see Spring in Town next to Spring in the Country. Both were painted in 1941. Spring in Town preserves the idyllic Midwestern myth without conflict, or so it seems. Sue Taylor's book, Grant Wood's Secrets, contains incredibly insightful, well-researched explanations and critical interpretations of these paintings. She suggests that the people in these paintings are Wood's family. I will leave it at that. I can't describe it as well as she wrote it. I'll just say that Taylor's book is must-read stuff, as Elaine alluded to earlier. Wanda Korn, Tripp Evans, and Sue Taylor's research and criticism, it's all must-read stuff for anyone wanting to really understand Grant Wood. So I hope our foray into critical cultural theory will help anyone wanting to understand why and how scholars are just as important as biographers and journalists and general observers when it comes to answering the question, what are we to make of these artifacts and this man's story? For what it's worth, there's a scholar named Henry Adams who's written some important stuff on Wood. He says today's journalists are particularly important and often overlooked. They have research tools and a bit of a different instinct that fills in a lot of the gaps that the scholars don't get to. So let's go back to Goffman. What did Goffman give us to explore the concept of identity in Grant Wood's life and art, specifically the Midwestern city identity? I think we arrive at this. Grant Wood was a double agent chameleon. He crafted his identity according to his situation very carefully. He valued survival, exploration, and expression. Like his paintings, he was aware that different people would have different reads. Irving Goffman theorized that the identity you create may not be the identity that others see. Grant Wood crafted his identities for multiple audiences, and he relished in the artistic expression of the exercise. Wood wasn't afraid of a deeper read, of people not picking up what he was putting down. In fact, he planted those reads, he crafted them, as if he wanted Goffman's cultural observers to take a closer look at his presentation of self in everyday life, his city self and his farmer self. And that is it. So I look forward to your questions. Feel free to take your mics off mute. And if we need to wait for questions, I do have some show and tell stuff that I think you guys might dig as well. Elaine, I don't have a handle on the chat. Please pipe in if you see some stuff in the chat here. I'd be happy to talk about anything.
Hey Joe, great presentation. We really loved it. And I wish I had noted what slide it was. There was a photo or a painting of his. I did a screen snap of it. It shows a vehicle like going up a hill and the trees are all kind of going to one way. It looks like a church at the top. Can you, I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about. I wonder what painting that one is.
That is Death on Ridge Road. And perhaps our friends from the area can talk more about that actual road.
No, I don't think that's the one, because I know which one that one is. This has like it's like looks like the Beverly Hillbillies truck going up a hill. You see it from behind. You know what, Elaine? I will send you a picture of it. Maybe you can tell me what that is.
I think that was a Thomas Hart Benton.
Oh, yeah, I
I don't
bet.
think it was Grant Wood.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I really love that one. So, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Thank you.
It's interesting. A lot of those Thomas Hart Benton paintings, and he did a lot of lithographs from the same company, the American Artists Association. There's always this interesting blend of the Midwestern prairie or countryside, so to speak, and cars or trains, or a train racing a horse. There's always this juxtaposition that Craven loved it. We've talked about in this forum before. Grant Wood didn't really put tractors in his stuff, and he kind of fancified the landscape and made it more beautiful in a very different way. So his stuff is very different from the other regionalists, but it also fit in its own way. Yeah, if you like Thomas Hart Benton, you can have a lot of fun looking at his work. He's played on a lot of the same themes in different ways, different angles. I'm no expert on Thomas Hart Benton, but I know it when I see it, and it's always so fascinating and contrasty and just interesting. There's always a story.
Joe, I think there's so much complexity, because I think, you know, we can talk about his Grant's gay identity, but I think he was a natural chameleon, to your point. I mean, just naturally. So to identify where the influence of one thing spills into the other, I mean, it's just all there. And this great, and I loved your context about the Lost Generation in Paris and how influential that was. I think that's really important, because Wood would know the edges of what people were doing back then, and would consciously be doing so much, I would think, with the way he approached his career, both practically and just for his own satisfaction.
you know, Wood was famous in Cedar Rapids before he got 1930s American Gothic famous. It's kind of fun to do searches in the newspaper archives before 1930. He was in the paper all the time. He was a local hometown hero. Even the weekly business paper, the Cedar Rapids, what was it called? The Republican, I think, were using him in metaphors about the oncoming, you know, business of America, and we can transform this town into industrial, you know, might. And in fact, you know, Grant Wood often said this, and here's his painting of that, and that shows up, you know, they were using him left and right in all kinds of contexts. And so then to think about, you know, the identity that he had, trying to do what any artist could do, bopping around from interior decorating to jewelry to, you know, business industrial commissions for Quaker Oats, and you know, the Cherry company. And then all of a sudden, you know, goes to Europe, plays around with these identities. He doesn't have to be who people expect him to be. And he came back a few times with a lot of paintings. And, you know, hometown hero comes home with a bunch of paintings. Let's show him at the library. He was still getting pub and press for it, and it was great. But everything changed in 1930. And all of a sudden, there was this expectation of, oh, well, you must live that life, represent it. You must understand it. That must be your childhood, your boyhood. And, oh, look, you're wearing overalls. It kind of just came together and it worked. So I don't look at that as anything else other than just being a genius. And, you know, he got questioned for it. People doubted his authenticity. You know, in some ways you can find a lot of records of that, but at the, at the same time, it worked. We don't question Andy Warhol or David Bowie or what was Bono from U2, Mephisto, you know, that alter ego. Like, it's very common for artists. Beyonce had one. She's, as of last night, she's the most decorated Grammy winner in history. She has a, I forget her alter ego's name, but it's very common for artists to play around with alter egos or different personas, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, that's what Grant Wood did. So I thought that would be fun to kind of slice them differently rather than just assume, oh yeah, the overalls, that was him. I don't think it was completely.
There's a comment, Joe, from Steve Feller, that points out that Coe is a rich resource as well, and has some movies from the 30s also. So that would be an interesting thing to see. I don't know if you've seen any of those, Joe, or not.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. And those of you doing your research, oh shoot, I forget her name. There's the nicest lady in that basement library, and whatever you go in there looking for, she will help you out. I did a big piece on Beulah Gundling once, the mother of synchronized swimming. She's from Cedar Rapids. She was a Coe rock and roll swimming star, and they've got all of her memorabilia, and the librarian there was so helpful. Their archives are pretty well organized. There are some things that aren't where you would expect them to be, though, so ask for help. Yeah, Coe, absolutely, great stuff. Plus, the library, you can walk around, and they've got their 2 floors with a ton of Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood, but you can walk around and like, there's the road to Wabeek. And then, you know, someone will come out and see you looking at it, and they'll say, do you want to see a picture? We drove there last Friday. Here's a picture of that same road. And, you know, they're all fans of this art and artwork, and, you know, the regionalists, there's some cool stuff there. And if you're into Marvin Cohn, they've got such a wide selection. They've got the cloud stuff and the staircase, you know, doorway stuff. Coe Library is fantastic. You'll recognize some really important Grant Wood pieces, huge ones that they have there. They display them behind glass that's not, that's reflective. So that's a little annoying to me, but I can get over that. To be that close to that stuff. Got his old high school sketches. It's a great place to check out a lot of cool stuff about Grant Wood.
Okay, some follow-ups from the chat. The librarian's name is Harleen Hansen.
Yes.
And Shannon is pointing out that Grant Wood's dress, the way he dressed, changed significantly after he married Sarah Sherman Maxon and moved to Iowa City in 35.
Yeah, great point, Shannon. He looks a little more stuffy, and you know, once he was in those circles, what, 4 years in, they put him in charge of the Society for Cruelty to Speakers, or what was it? And he was in charge with bringing in a lot of guests. he demanded to decorate that room where they met. And he purposely did it in styles and patterns that were way old and outdated. And that was hilarious to him. But to play the part, to be able to zing that kind of humor around, I think Shannon, you're right. It's tweed. It's a lot of suits, and those photos read very differently than the photos of him around other kinds of people from earlier in his life.
And Barbara pointed out, and I thought of this too, Barbara, while he was talking. I'm like, well, one of those personas was all the wackadoodle-doo stuff with the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Speakers. Those photos were kind of over the top.
Those are
I
great.
have
The most-
some of those. They're great. I have a funny thing that I think Paul Jewell found out last year. He actually spoke to Trip Evans and found out that they chose the cover of his book to have Death on the Ridge Road. He didn't choose it, but they chose it because it's got a lot of red and green, and it was coming out at Christmas time.
Interesting.
Oh. Always be selling.
Right.
That's interesting. Elaine, you mentioned the sketch that I have that Sue Taylor put as the frontispiece of her book. She wanted it to be the cover. And so when she was talking to me about getting images of it, and we were scanning it and doing all this stuff, but her publisher said, no way. We need something colorful, something with a couple different reads. And so she explained, like, talk to art critics. This sketch of an ear of corn, if you look at it closely, where did my copy go? Art critics will say, well, it represents a hand. It's a phallus. It's self-congratulatory. There's a whole thing about it. Yeah, there it is. And so Sue Taylor wanted that to be the cover, but yeah, her publisher thought it would make more sense to use Return from Bohemia, which, to their credit, there's a lot to interpret from this and the theme. I think that's a good call, but yeah, it's interesting, Paul, how sometimes these decisions by publishers can lead to some different things. You've published some books, Paul. Have you ever run into that, or did you have free reign on everything?
Well, I've always had free reign on any of those, Joe. I always tried to find something that I thought fit in nicely with the description, especially with the Grant Wood and the State Fair book, to show the young man milking the cow. I thought was appropriate.
If those of you on the call aren't familiar, Paul has written some great books, fun to read. That Paul, you're so good at finding these nuggets and connecting dots. And I think I have a couple of pieces in the Gazette that started from nuggets in your books that I just thought, well, what is this about? Well, that's cool, and connected some other dots. And great stuff. What's your next one? What are you working on now, Paul?
Well, I should say first that what pleases me the most, Joe, is when I can find a nugget that, as you said, leads some other researcher to find another nugget. And so the chase goes on. Right now I'm working some on the people who posed or sat for Grant Wood, and a little bit of a biographical sketch about their lives. It probably won't be anything I'll publish for the public because it takes so much work to get the permissions and pay any costs involved. But I might run off some just for people like you and the people that are part of the forum here tonight that I could give a free copy to, and I wouldn't be doing anything illegal because I wouldn't be selling them. So I might do something like that. I'm also real interested in the lineage of Grant Wood, and I know the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, there was a young man there some years ago that did a lot of work on that too. But that kind of fascinates me.
Oh, cool. Well, and thank you.
Yeah.
We look forward to our private copies. That's great.
Yes, yes. Boy, you never know. Speaking of nuggets, my goodness. It's like things are dropping out of the trees like wonderful little pearly gifts tonight. Oh, goodness. Well, yeah, let's see here. Carrie Mayer's book, The Paris Bookseller, is a novel about Shakespeare and Company, the American bookstore in Paris in the 20s. The bookstore was home to the likes of Hemingway and Joyce. It's home to Americans in Paris. Thanks, Linda Peterson. And Mike in the chat, Mike Wilson, we're kind of going back and forth about the whole shape-shifting thing has been around a long time. Even if people cycle through being outraged, it's been with us forever, you know, essentially, you know.
I came across a quote where Walt Whitman was talking about the different personalities we have, and he did some stuff in that area I thought was cool. I couldn't quite rein it in. That's not my area of expertise, but I just think this concept is so cool. And you know, in rock and roll, especially that one slide, I had a bunch of rock and rollers in there.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks twice. It's actually pretty cool. And sometimes it's cool when they do it and then come back because maybe you didn't get the whole Garth Brooks, Chris Gaines thing. Or I don't know, there's just so many different ways to play around with that stuff. Hey, I have some show and tell if we have some time. You might find some of this interesting. So I know a lot of you collect like the real lithographs and paintings and stuff, and a lot of you collect ephemera. That is a fun hobby. I mean, a lot of people have so much fun. Just go to eBay and search Grant Wood, and you'll find buttons that were printed, you know, in the 70s, or you know, museum exhibit guides that explain, and to read the language of how they describe this painting in 1935 versus how they describe it in 1960. And you just find some surprising, there's a lot of junk, you know, American Gothic plates and crap that'll never be worth anything. But if you sift and sort through that, you can find some neat stuff. So over the years, sometimes I've picked up some neat things. This is a copy of his Revolt Against the City mini book that we now know Frank Mott wrote, not him. But it's a contribution to that whole discourse about, you know, the city versus country thing and revolting against these hallowed values. So it's an interesting read, but there's a really interesting thing. You know how in the back of books, it'll say, we use this font, and here's why. It's got one of those. My camera's not showing it. And I'll just read it. You see that it's shaped in an upside down triangle there. It says, the body of this brochure is composed in 12-point Vogue type, light face, a modern adaptation of the type called Gothic by printers. With initials of tempo light, the lines are separated by 6 points. I thought that was kind of, you know, probably completely accidental, unintentional, but I don't know, neat tie-in. So this is a magazine that I came across. Let me get it. Oh, you can see some of it there. So this is an issue of Fortune magazine from 1935. I think this was $5 on eBay. And it's got pieces. It's a massive, massive magazine, and readers can see his murals. It was oh my gosh, this background technology is killing me. It's like, it's hard to show. But anyway, it's really neat to thumb around in this huge, huge magazine. It covers an entire coffee table, but it's an early iteration of pre-war luxury magazines. And so the articles and what was highbrow at the time and the criticism in it, the advertisements, it's just really interesting to take a look at all of this. And then Grant Wood is appropriate in his artwork and the way they describe those murals in Iowa City.
Joe,
Yes.
Joe, if you turn off your background, we'll be able to see everything perfectly.
Yeah, I can do that.
And while you're doing that, we've got a question here from Barb Edler. And would you be able to elaborate on how they discovered that Grant Wood did not write the essay, Revolt Against the City?
I believe it was two different things that I saw. One was an autograph by Mott to somebody else, and it mentioned in parentheses, I ghost wrote this, and it was in his own handwriting. So yeah, I I've seen it referenced in a couple of books. And then
Okay.
I'm trying to remember what the other reference was. It was a reference actually to poor Nan. We love Nan, but a lot of the stuff she wrote kind of turned out to not really be correct or completely understood. She mentioned that Grant did write it, but often where were the articles? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Often when you see that reference to Mott, you'll see the reference to, oh, and by the way, in Nan's book, she said Grant wrote it, but he really didn't, because we know this from Mott and Mott's family, or, you know, that kind of thing. I'm curious about the question. Were you doing some stuff in that area?
Barb? Oh,
I was just curious. That's all. I just wondered how they figured it out.
Oh, okay.
good mystery.
Just curiosity.
This is fun. This is from 1942. After Spring-in-Town came out, the Saturday Evening Post, you know, America's at war. They're trying to get a handle on what the nation can do, and these values, that whole war kind of ended. First of all, H.L. Mencken, as it turned out, he was a fan of Mussolini before Mussolini became the Mussolini we know. And so even though he was this highbrow critic and he lampooned the heck out of the Midwest, he slowly became irrelevant as we went to war. And a lot of his other heroes kind of turned out to be fascists. So anyway, the publishers of the Saturday Evening Post, they thought, oh yeah, Grant Wood, American Gothic, you know, we need to start growing victory gardens. There are a lot of reasons why this image on this magazine at this time made a lot of sense. And like I mentioned about the other magazines, it's a lot of fun to thumb through there and just get context for what was happening at the time. You should know about this. This is called A Treasury of American Prints, and it was put together by Thomas Craven. In addition to art criticism, he put together a lot of things from Associated American Artists. He got permission from artists, and he was trying to champion like regionalism. And he made books available. So you could buy this. This was very popular. There are a ton of these on eBay. I think this one was $5. And it's got a lot of lithographs. I think it has 4 or 5, maybe 6 of Grant Wood's in the back. But you should also know that the measurements of these lithographs are different than the measurements of Grant Wood's actual lithographs. So sometimes you will see these being sold at auction house. I've seen these at like known online auction houses being sold framed as a real lithograph. But if you look at the measurements, you're like, that's not a real lithograph. That's from Craven's book. But anyway, Craven put out a lot of these books. And when you look at the lineup of who else he chose to put in here and kind of read what other writers have written about his writing and his penchant for this masculinity thing, it's really interesting. You can thread a lot of that thinking through his writing and what was put into this book. I think that's it for now. Any other questions? I should have brought more junk downstairs. Any other questions? Yeah, Sylvia. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Well,
Now-
speaking of oh, go ahead, Sylvia.
All right. I was just going to say it's a fabulous presentation. And now I am terrified about following you. Oh my God. Now this is just a little question, but I want to go back to the man who Seashore Hall is named for. And can you tell me his name again? Carl Seashore, but you said he was Swedish?
Yes, he came to America when he was 3 years old, and it was one of his teachers who couldn't say his name. His name is Fjorsted. Let me see if I can get the exact, I will email it to you. I do have it. I can't call it up
that's
quickly
great.
with everything on here. But yeah, he has a really interesting story. His academic chops were just unparalleled. You know, at the time, he was running the philosophy and psychology departments. Like they weren't even separate yet. He was a big part of like making psychology past, you know, Jungian Freud stuff and actually, you know, well, not past, but propped up to be taken seriously. So Yeah, and apparently he was really, really tall. I've seen a few references that remarked about how he was just a towering figure in the classroom and just walking down the street.
Now, Joe, speaking of the lithographs, I am fascinated that there's 2 catalog raisonné of lithographs out there. And one is from Associated American Artists, 1984. And then the other one is Ben Johnson's book, Bruce Johnson's book, which is like really rich and full of things. But what fascinates me is that those were put together, but they plunked lithographs out of his artworks to make catalog raisonnés out of. And does anybody know where they're at in Iowa City? Udavai was talking about getting going on that for the whole of his, at the last symposium, they talked about cataloging all of his stuff.
Shannon, weren't you talking to somebody who had a hand in that?
I spoke with Jim Hayes and Maura Pilcher over at the Art Colony, and I think that was last summer. I should call and see what the update is, but they were searching for a PhD to sort of lead that, spearhead that endeavor, and I don't know. I don't have a status report on it.
Okay.
I had heard Chestakowski has been, I'm sure I said that wrong, had been working on it for decades. It sounds like maybe that is kind of coming to confluence with some other people. But yeah, I've wondered that when you look at a lot of different artists, it's like, here's the official Bible book and it's got everything in it. By the way, that expert on Dali, he said there have been 2 of those printed and they're both full of errors. So he's working on a 3rd one that he's got the support of everybody and all the scholars in the museums, and it will finally be accurate. But, that's one of the problems in Dali's case. He signed some blank pieces of paper as an artist statement, trying to answer the question, what is art? It's whatever you want to make it. Here's my signature. Have fun. Like they're artists pressing the boundaries, right? So there are a lot of things they had to figure out in Dali's case. In Grant Wood's case, I think there are a couple of online auction sites. One is called Live Auctioneers. Another one is called Invaluable. There's some known ones, Christie's and Sotheby's. Heritage Auction House is number 3 in the country. They have legit stuff. I've bought a lithograph from them. But some of these smaller online ones, they've got some sketchy stuff. And, I think last Saturday, there was a painting of a young boy in a tan suit, and it was put out there as a Grant Wood, but it wasn't an oil, it was watercolor, something he really didn't do since high school. And I forget what it sold for, but anybody could look at that and be like, that's not a Grant Wood, so the provenance wasn't there. It's that's why I think the ephemera is fun, because you can collect some neat stuff. Deb can speak to something I've encountered. There are some people who were close to Nan who they need money or they don't know who else to give their stuff to. And every few months will trickle out letters from Nan Wood, real letters, and they're on eBay. And sometimes they go for $10 and they don't really say anything. Other times they'll go for a few $100s, but you can take a screen cap of it for your own research. You'll recognize her address sticker after a while, and it's in the U of I library stuff, so they're real. I think Deb and I have both reached out to her to say, hey, who are you? Like, how is it, just, I'm trying to learn, like, can you show me your stuff before you sell it all? And she just trickles it out. Some came up just recently, right, Deb?
Yes, and what tugs at my heartstrings is when she references my aunt and uncle. Of course, her brother Frank was my great uncle. And there was one that I bid on because she had talked about my Aunt Clara and Uncle Frank and how my Aunt Clara had risen to the occasion, even though she wasn't well. I missed getting that one though, but at least, like you said, I got the screenshot so I can read what Nan had written. And those letters were to the Brown family, I think. And there was a lot of them, I think, at some auction, and apparently this woman bought them. So like you said, she trickles them out periodically. but I do enjoy seeing them, even though, you know, I don't always win the ones I want. So,
I think, was it
Where are
you
those?
or
Are those
on
eBay?
eBay? They show up on eBay. Sometimes they'll show up on Invaluable, but they're usually just on eBay. And you know what? I'm trying to remember the sellers' names, but there were a few printing proofs from one of the printers that did the Sinclair Main Street book. And it was real deal legit. I think it was her, and she let it go, and I didn't get it. But every now and then I'm like, what? That looks real. But I don't like that cat and mouse game of what's real and what's not. I think I bought a fake once just because it was so bad, and it was $5, you know, but there's some stuff out there. I'm more interested in the history. And if I can grab a screen cap of something like that goes through an auction site, that's kind of fun. But yeah, in case you didn't know, there's some cool Easter egg hunting that you can do at these auction sites. And even if you're not going to buy, you can take screenshots of the backs of some of these things, or the letters or whatnot, or just to get an idea about like what was out there. You know, there's an officially sanctioned Catholic Church cookbook from Waterloo that Deb and I have. And it's got Nan's recipes and Grant recipes, and it was done with permission of the family. And there's some neat things like that floating around out there that can be fun to grab. And when you get it in the mail, it's like, you know what, I think I'm going to make this cornbread. This, you know, it's it's a lot of fun.
The name of the cookbook is Cooking in the Land of Corn, and it's St. Edward's Parish, I believe, which my aunt and uncle, when they lived in Waterloo, were members of, and they of course had Nan contribute to that. And yeah, it's really great because it has what's the name of the painting on the cover? I always forget it. Isn't
Was
that
it-
awful?
I can't remember. It's upstairs. I can't remember. Was it Young Corn?
No. It's the one where I even did a poem on it, and they're all sitting eating the meal.
Dinner
it's
for Threshers?
For Threshers?
Dinner for Threshers. Yes, I don't know why that I had a roadblock there, but yeah, that's on the cover. Yeah.
Well, speaking of,
Great cookbook.
that'd be neat to see. Speaking of Dinner for Threshers, Saturday when we went down to the presentation in Eldon with Mike Zaz, he had a study for Dinner for Threshers, full color, and it was just the far right, if you're looking at the painting, the far right panel with the stove and the woman there. And so it was quite striking. And then he had another piece that was a study for the young man milking the cow.
Oh, okay.
And so yeah, he had those two pieces there. And I tell you what, if you've never been down to Eldon to see the collection they have there, it's really quite something in the center. It's a little unexpected. I didn't expect there to be quite as much and it to be quite as rich as it was. And there's a charming letter from Nan, between Nan and the city fathers, inviting her down to come to their festivities when they were putting together American Gothic Days. And she made it happen, and it's very charming. So anyway, it's a neat excursion if you can make it happen.
Oh, there's the cookbook.
Oh, you got it? Aha. Oh, Linda's got it too. Yeah.
It's green with Dinner for Threshers on it.
There you go. Oh, nice.
So we had multiple copies, obviously, because of family and my you'll notice in the front it'll mention Mr. and Mrs. Frank Wood, which was my uncle and aunt, that they were, because my Aunt Clara, my side of the family, a lot of them were raised Roman Catholic. Of course, Frank was not. I think they were Quakers. Anyway, So he must have converted to Catholicism at some point, because he attended Catholic church with my aunt, and then Frank is the only sibling that's not buried in Iowa. He and his wife are buried at a Catholic cemetery in San Diego, California, called Holy Cross. So you can, if you're into ancestry and find a grave, that's where their headstone is.
Well, and speaking of that, Paul, it's going to be it's fascinating. I'm glad to hear your focus about the lineage of the family, as well as the subjects of the paintings. I think that will really be a neat contribution to what we know or don't know.
Well, some of that just stems from in my years of doing some research on Grant Wood. It always puzzled me because I knew that some of Hattie's siblings, especially one sibling, a brother, had been very successful in his vocation. And it always made me wonder why they didn't, the Weaver family didn't do more to help Grant Wood's family when they were struggling financially. And so that kind of led me into this area of interest with the Weavers.
Did you ever find out anything about the falling out with Jack? I'd be really
No.
curious about that too.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too. And of course, Jack and Hattie died at about the same time. They were just months apart, I think. So there's some stories to be told. There's a wonderful picture, and some of you have seen it, of all of the Weavers together at the grandparents' home. And that house is still standing. They're in Cedar Rapids, not far from Coe College. So there's the thing about Grant Wood, and it's probably true of any famous person or any famous artist, there's always so many doors yet to be opened. And that's what makes it so much fun. I've really enjoyed that. And I loved Joe's talk tonight. Joe is such a fine researcher that everything that he says, he's really worked on. And I appreciate that. I think all of us do.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was very kind. Thank you.
Joe, yes. And I just love that the Cedar Rapids Library is preserving these so we could go back. And Sylvia and Barbara, you got nothing to worry about. You guys are so immersed in this stuff. We're going to be equally fascinated. I know I am, because your abilities to go down rabbit holes are quite refined.
Last year, Elaine, when I guess Dorothy had spoke on your behalf to ask me if I wanted to participate. And I thought, when she first said it, I thought, oh no, okay, Dorothy will do it. I'll just kind of chime in. Well, I think she kind of tricked me a little bit, because I ended up doing pretty much most of it and she just introduced. But anyway, so I would not, whoever's going to do one who hasn't done one yet, if I can do it, you can do it. Just kind of have a timeline of what you want to talk about. But anyway.
Share the passion. Share the passion. That's right. There's room for everybody on this. Absolutely.
Prepare yourself for the ladies.
Woo!
One Grecian urn. Trickle, 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 trickle. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I've thought about that a lot when I'm researching some stuff. So that's going to be fun. Oh my goodness. Well, what do you have? Oh, look at Steve, what he's got. Okay, I was just seeing Steve Feller. I was just looking at your backdrop. Yeah.
Well, that's Coe College around 1910.
Yeah. I was wondering the year, but yeah, that's neat. It's really great.
You can get those
Well,
on eBay.
Well, I suppose all good things must come to an end. And, but we can come back next week. So, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. It's so enjoyable to spend time with you all. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week.